If you had millions of dollars, large muscles, and a bit of spare spandex in your sewing kit at home, would you end up going out to fight crime like this dude? This is Groundeffected. My name is your dad, and I can tell you, if I had all those things, I'd be on a boat somewhere. Probably in the Caribbean. Or probably not, because I don't like boats, nor do I like the heat. But that's not important. This video was sponsored by CA 3D Studios. They are a patron, and I will tell you more about them later. For now, let's just get into how I painted this Batman, based on Frank Miller Batman, or something like that. I don't even know. It's just really cool, and I decided to paint it. So after the curing was complete, I decided to paint my model with black because I wanted the effect of this model to have a dark appearance at the end. Starting out with the base, I'm gonna start making the rat and the rest of the base pieces look kind of like a stone. And to do this, I'm gonna dry brush incrementally a lighter greys over the top of these parts. I'm gonna use my wife's makeup brush. Of course, she doesn't know this, but what she doesn't know can't hurt her. Also, they make very good dry brushing brushes for this particular instance. After I start out with the darkest grey, I'm gonna allow that to dry and then work my way up to a lighter grey. I do this in 2 increments so as to not to go way too mushy and grey all over the place. You want to try and make sure that you leave quite a fair amount of the black in the crevasses on the piece. Now, in order to bring back some of that black, I'm going to use an enamel wash. This is a black enamel wash, and in hindsight, I've no idea how to use this stuff, and also in future sight, it worked out pretty well, so no problems there. This stuff just flows into all the gaps and makes it nice and dark in all the crevasses. Now, of course, I did the same treatment to the brick structure, the rocks, the stuff that is around the outside on the fence. Of course, the fence itself needed to be a different color, but we will get to that. Now, you can't just have a grey rock or grey piece of base, because that's very boring to look at. So in order to create a little bit more life and something more exciting to look at, I'm going to use a multitude of different washes to give some color to this grey boring piece of base that I had painted by doing what I previously did. Now, I didn't do that because I'm crazy. I did it because I needed to create myself a sketch, technically a light sketch, and this gives me the effect of how the light would be hitting the piece all on its own. And then by using some colors, I can create the effects that this piece is not just been painted grey, and actually make it look like it has some saturation to it. I used a dark silver to paint all the fence pieces, which are technically metal, I think. I then used a lighter silver and overbrushed. That is a technical term that professional artists use for just slapping your brush around over the area. Now for the rest of the base, it is pretty much just sand or mud or dirt, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't matter. This section is brown. And as you will notice, I didn't just paint it brown. I left the black that was underneath there, and I slowly but surely built up in stippling motions with brown colors, starting with a dark brown and going to a slightly lighter brown. This is all going to be hidden anyway, because it's actually going underneath some moss. But to get to that, I needed to make sure that I had at least some shape to this base. Now, some would think that it is slightly crazy to put this much effort into something you're going to end up covering up. However, I would say this is all part of the process, and I was having fun. I also dry brushed some of those lighter browns over the top just to give it a little bit more texture. Then, taking a green wash, I sprayed into all the areas that I was going to paint, and by paint what I mean is actually just place some moss texture later. This video was sponsored by CA3D Studios. They are a Patreon over on Patreon, funny enough, and what they do is you subscribe to them monthly and you get, for the return of your money, a lovely set of models. These are delivered to you in the form of STL, which is the fancy computer term for 3D model that you stick in your 3D printer and click print to print out. Now of course, there are a lot of options to choose from when you do decide to go and look at their Patreon. For this model, however, it doesn't matter which one you choose because all of the tiers give you access to this model this month. It is really great to see some of these people supporting creators like myself, and for that I urge you to go and join CA3D Studios Patreon and have a look at what they've got available, because you will not be disappointed. So to create that texture, I'm going to use different colored flock mixed with other colored flock. The 2mm flock that I have is basically little small strands which are kind of grass like, but for our scale it's okay, it works out. I also use some foam flock as well. I'm going to use basing glue from World War Scenics, but you can replace this with pretty much any craft or PVA glue that you can find. I squirt this into a tub to make it easier to work with, and then using my worst brush, not my favorite brush because I had to throw this brush away at the end, I'm gonna dab that very carefully into the places that I want the moss to be. So this is gonna grow in all the dark, dampish areas on the base, and also around some of the corners and stuff, just to really push the illusion of the moss. Now once I've got a small patch of this painted on, I'm gonna stick it into a box and sprinkle over my mixture of flock. This is the kind of thing you want to do in steps. Do not do this in one go, because if you painted the entire base with all the areas that you wanted moss to be, and you did that with glue and then try to sprinkle your moss over the top, it won't gonna stick, especially on a day like today where it is rather warm and the glue is drying fairly quick. Now I'm not gonna lie, you're gonna see some of the glue kind of seeping through and it looks terrible, but do not fear, because this glue dries clear. I did the same treatment to all the other parts that I wanted moss to be on, and one of the main reasons why I would use a box is because actually it's a freaking mess. This stuff gets everywhere, it goes all over the place. Don't do this if you're using fans to keep yourself cool, because it will blow everywhere. It's going to be in all the linings of your pockets, it's going to be in your hair, some of it might even be in your teeth, and you will look funny when you smile on camera. So just a word of warning, be careful while using this. I also added some scatter around the base as well. This was just pretty much pieces of cork that was mixed into a different colored flock. And to seal that in, I used watered down PVA glue and I sprayed alcohol over the top just to make sure that the flow of the glue happened to work better. Once it had mostly dry, and by mostly dry I mean it was still very wet in my case, and I ended up blowing most of it off. So don't do it the way I did it. You want to let this dry, but once it had dried, I used some washes and other effects to spray around the base just to darken up some of the moss so it wasn't so bright green and burned your eyeballs with the greenness of the brightest moss in the world. Now working on the bat himself, I'm going to start out with greys again. Yes, a lot of this model was grey, but I don't want it to be just grey, so I added a little bit of blue into the grey so that it had a little bit of coolness to the grey itself. I then worked my way up using just flat greys to a brighter highlight, and this is so that I again can be creating myself a light sketch. Now of course this is going to be very boring to look at, so in order to give it some more fun, is that the word? Let's call it fun, I dry brush some textures over the top. Now this is way too white, and white is not good. You can never have fun with white, so I used a little bit of black and blue mixed together into the shadows to create some depth, and then I took Drakenhof Nightshade and I just pretty much loosely sprayed that from mostly the shadowed areas all over the model. I then mixed a load of blue into white again, and I went over the top of the model, this time from the highlight areas, and I sprayed that over everything. Now as you can see, now that it's dried, it has quite a bluish appearance to it. This gives me a feeling of grey, but it still feels cool and like it has saturation to it. I then use black to block out all the parts of the suit that are going to be black. The black that I use is Vallejo black, and it is the model paint range, and you mix it with water to make it flow a little bit better, and it paints over everything like magic, and I really like this paint. Using Nuln Oil, I went over all the creases and all the seams on the suit. I also painted this into the scuffs and scratches across the suit as well. Now, I'm not so sure whether this Batman got confused with the Marvel movie, but he happened to have about 784,000 pouches across his waist. But that is not going to deter me, and I painted them all with pouch color. And I used a slightly lighter pouch color to give them some details, and I used the dark wash over the top, which I'm pretty sure was Agrax Earthshade, to give them a mucky look. I wanted them to look dirty. There are pouches, they're going to be dirty, they're old, they've been used. He does not polish his pouches. Let's just move on from that. Now, using a mixture of green into my black, I'm going to slowly start building up highlights on all the black parts. I took a dark silver and I painted the cool little wings he has on his gloves. I also glued this hand in at this time. Now, in general, I would probably use magnets for this part, but because this model was going to be on my shelf, I decided to glue him. Working on the face, I used a very similar technique to what I use on pretty much all my skin tones, except for I changed up the colors a little bit. And the only reason I changed the colors is because I don't want to have all the exact same skin tone painted on every single character. So I just experiment. When I'm painting, I don't always know exactly what I'm going to be doing. Sometimes I experiment with things and I like to just try different combinations of colors, even though I know it's going to give me a similar result, but with a slightly different look. It's good to just experiment with these things. I used the 3-color wash to give some depth and life to the skin. The one thing to make note of when you are using a wash step like this, the red is not just red, it is actually a transparent red. This makes it so much easier to do this step. Then taking black again, I painted off the rest of his cowl. And then I masked that up using a Vallejo liquid mask. This is essentially just a liquid latex, I think, and basically you paint it over the parts you don't want paint to go on, and you allow it to dry. I then used the same green and black mix to go over the cowl in the exact same way that I did on the other black parts of the suit. The reason that I used green is to keep with the cool theme of the rest of the piece. This helps to tie everything together and doesn't look like I was just completely crazy when I picked the colors for this model. I picked out some skin tones on the suit and I pretty much just painted them in the cracks where it looked like the suit was torn. I added some highlights to some of the other pieces, specifically around the chest and on some of the edges of the torn pieces of the suit. Now, before I can call this model done, I needed to give a little bit more life to some of those black pieces, and I used gloss to go over some of the trim areas just to create a contrast look between the shiny parts and the matte parts. This helps it look like I've actually painted them in different colors. I then painted his eyes using deck tan, and once that was dry, it was time to work on his 5 o'clock shadow across his chin. This Batman does not shave ever, so I need to make sure that it looks like that. And in order to do that, I mixed some of the darker skin tone that I initially used with a black, and I watered this down so thin it was ridiculous. I patched that on with a sponge and I dabbed on a couple of little stippled dots for the rest of the stubble. For his mouth, I first painted with a very dark reddish kind of color just to get a baseline for the inside of his mouth. I then used bright pink over the gummed areas to create a highlight over those. I then used deck tan over each tooth individually, carefully making sure to leave a little bit of the paint underneath it around the gaps of each tooth. I then used Resin flesh shade over the top of them to give them a dirty look, like he hasn't brushed his teeth in days. Now to add the last final effects on this model, since it is a darker sort of looking model, I wanted to make sure that there was dust and it looked like he was living in this environment. So I used some pigment powders to dusty the model all over the place, and that's where I called it done. As usual, I hope that you picked something out of this video that helps you, maybe answers a question that you had about painting, or maybe even 3D printing. Now of course, we are at the end of the video, but before I get into the best part of the video that we've all been waiting for, I'd like to say a special thank you to my patrons for their support over on my Patreon. If you would like to support the channel further than watching the video, and we all know that you shared it with your gran already, so the next thing you should probably do is type some words in the little square box down below, because for some reason, I think that helps me get seen by more people. I don't know, I'm not a professional. All I know is that I'm painting my models and making cool things on YouTube, and if you want to see more of that, I need your support, and the best way you can support me is by sharing videos and liking them. Also, if you can afford it, then join the Patreon, because that helps me greatly. It's because of the Patreons that I'm able to keep the lights blinding my eyeballs and the videos coming. Now if you didn't like anything you saw in this video, you should share it with your gran. And then after you've done that, you should kindly please f off. Do you think they're ever gonna get tired of me telling them to f off?